Welcome to grade 11 equations and inequalities. So solving quadratic equations using factorization, it's one of the most common method of solving quadratic equations. So before we continue with this, there are a few terms or rather terminology that you need to actually familiarize yourself with. So the first thing is an expression, which I think you know. An expression is a term or a group of terms consisting of numbers, variables which may be letters, and the basic operators such as your addition sign, your subtraction sign, multiplication sign, division sign, as well as exponents as well. And then when it comes to equation, an equation is basically a mathematical statement that has said that two expressions are actually equal. So you may have something like 2x plus 1, which is equals to 0. This whole thing is an equation because it is indicated that 2x plus 1 is equals to 0. So the other term that we have is inequality. So an inequality states the relationship between two expressions. So for example, 5 is greater than 1. It indicates the relationship between 5 and 1 and saying that 5 is greater than 1. Or you can have 5 is greater or equals to 1. This is just an example. So this indicates that 5 is actually greater or it can be equals to 1. Or you can have x is greater or equals to 2. This indicates the relationship between 2 as well as the x. Right. The other term that we also have is a solution. So a solution is one of those numbers that you get after solving an x, after solving for a b, after solving for a c, or after solving for any variable that you are asked to solve. So the answers that you get are actually the solution. So for example, if I have 2x plus 1, which is equals to 0, x, after solving for it, I'm going to get x is equals to negative 1 all over 2. If I take this negative 1 over 2, which is the solution, and substitute it into 2x plus 1, I am going to get 2 into negative 1 over 2 plus 1, which is equals to 0. And then this cancels this. You are left with minus 1 plus 1, which is equals to 0. So 0 is equals to 0. So a solution is a value or a set of values that satisfy the original problem statement. So it means our statement in this case is satisfied because the left hand side is equals to the right hand side. So 0 is equals to 0. So the other term that we have is a root. So a root of an equation is the value of x such that the f of x, function of x, is equals to 0. So it basically indicates that it's the values of x when the y is equals to 0. So for example, if we have an equation which is y is equals to x squared minus 4, basically if you want to look for the roots of this equation, what you will say is that you will replace your y by 0 and say that it's equals to x squared minus 4, and then factorize the x squared minus 4 and solve for x. So you will get two x values, which are x is equals to minus 2 as well as x is equals to 2. So those two values are actually referred to as your roots. So they're basically points in a graph, or rather on a graph, that indicates that the y value is actually 0. Because if you remember well from your drawings of line graphs, you can actually remember that the point where your graph actually cuts the x-axis, the value for y there is actually 0. So those are actually your roots. Examples of quadratic equations. So we have the first equation, which is this one. So if you take a look at this equation, you can see that the degree of this x is actually 2. So that actually indicates that this is a quadratic equation. And then you also have a into a minus 3. If you multiply this a by this a, you're going to get a squared, which indicates that this is also a quadratic equation. With the third one, basically what you're going to need to do is to find the common denominator of all the terms in this equation, and then multiply every term by that common denominator. So along the steps, you will see that you are going to get a term with b squared in it. So that will also indicate that you also have a quadratic equation. Right. So a quadratic equation usually has two answers. So you will get two x values or two roots, as we have already mentioned that roots can also be those x values that you find after solving an equation. So you can call them answers or roots. Sometimes it can have no solution, or it can only have one answer. So methods of solving quadratic equation. The most common method, as I've mentioned, it's method of factorization, where one side of the equation has to be 0 to solve the quadratic equation. So a standard form of a quadratic equation, or the original form or the standard form, so we need to have ax squared plus bx plus c, which is equals to 0. This is actually the standard form of a quadratic equation. So for example, if you write it in terms of numbers, you can have 2x squared plus 3x plus 6. So this 2 is your a, this 3 is your b, and this 6 is actually your c, which is equals to 0. So this is the standard form of a quadratic equation. And then we move further. So for example, if we go back to this equation right here, we can see that we have 2x squared minus 5x, which is equals to 12. So if we have to write that in a standard form, we are going to have 2x squared minus 5x minus 12, which is equals to 0. This is the standard form of that equation.